Chapter 1 Slater entered his study and he locked the door behind him. He turned on the lights, but kept the illumination low as a precaution, because whenever he returned from the secret meetings the bright lights affected his eyes for a few seconds. The study smelt of cigar smoke, even though Slater hadn't smoked in the room for 2 days. The study was the only place in the house that Slater's wife allowed his habit. Hence Mrs. Slater kept out of the study. But the smoking pretense provided Slater with a decent cover for his secret meetings. Slater pulled back a section of the thick Native American pattern carpet, which revealed a digital combination safe. Slater opened the floor safe and he took out an optical device. The optical device's lenses were tinted, microphones were built into the sides and an adjustable strap was attached. Slater slipped the optical device over his large forehead and he positioned it over his blue eyes. Afterwards, Slater sat in his comfortable leather chair. "I'm ready," said Slater. Immediately, the glowing body of a woman appeared in Slater's sight. The woman was a beta. Betas were transmutated women who had a genius-level understanding of technological communication networks. Additionally, betas were granted the ability to enter cyberspace and any other communication network on Earth. One beta was assigned to a principal. And Slater was a principal. A principal was a top-level operator in the secret organization that regulated the global economy. Moreover, principals worked in the central banks of the major world economies. The principals monitored the economies through the central banks. Slater worked in the United States Treasury Department. He was attached to the Office of International Affairs as a research and risk analyst. Slater had worked in the Office of International Affairs for 25 years. He was respected by his peers. Younger workers often picked Slater's 50-year-old brain. Also, Slater was viewed as a family man. Slater was married for 26 years. He had 2 children and 5 grandchildren. Slater and his wife lived in the suburbs of Washington, D.C. The curvaceous beta said, "Plugging you in." Slater relaxed in the chair and he closed his hands together. The beta connected Slater to the virtual reality meeting room. The simulated room resembled a closed office with a fireplace and 7 comfortable chairs formed a circle. The other members except the head of the Regulators were present at the unscheduled meeting. Avant, the leader of the Regulators, had called the meeting for a matter of high importance. Slater politely greeted his fellow principals. The other principals worked in the Monetary Authority of Singapore, the Reserve Bank of India, the Brazilian Central Bank, the Bank of England and the European Central Bank. The betas stood at the sides of their respective principals. A principal and a beta operated as a team. The beta brought information from monitored communications or searched for information. The principal made decisions based on the information. The decisions fell into 3 categories: take no action, take moderate action and take lethal action. However, a principal had a meeting before a decision was implemented since it may ripple into areas under the other principal's respective scopes. An urgent meeting was called only when a decision had gone outside of parameters. Therefore, Slater wondered if the Myrmidons' latest mission had encountered a difficulty. The Myrmidons were the military enforcers of the Regulators organization. The discovery of the identities of the third Axis powers was another possibility for the meeting. The first Axis powers were defeated in World War II. The second Axis powers were destroyed in the War on Terror. The third Axis powers were a mystery. The rumor in the world's weapons black markets, shady international financial circles and corrupted political states was that 3 entities had formed an alliance and were in the process of methodically moving power and money. Furthermore, it was unclear if the entities were countries, powerful individuals, or companies. Additionally, the reason for the alliance was uncertain. Slater asked his colleagues if they were aware of the reason for the meeting, but they were also clueless. Slater detested the lack of an agenda and he was dissatisfied with Avant's lateness. In fact, Slater was dissatisfied with Avant's stewardship of the regulators. Avant had made terrible mistakes and he had allowed certain events to spiral out of control. As a result, Slater had secret meetings with the other principals about replacing Avant. The other principals advised Slater that he had their backing if things worsened. Still, Slater was hesitant to challenge Avant. The reason was that Avant was appointed to the leadership position by the sole founder of the regulators, Alan Huber. Alan Huber had created the betas, he had chosen each of the principals, he had groomed the principals for their positions, he had given the principals meta-human powers and he had formed the Myrmidons. Huber ran the regulators while he tutored Slater and Avant for the leadership. Eventually, Avant won the leadership over Slater. Afterwards Huber retired. Slater pondered. I need for Avant to slip up badly so that I can have a solid reason to seize control, thought Slater while he held his hands together. Slater had a long face, shaven beard and mustache, and he had sideburns. He was 5'8" and was in good health because of his control over every molecule of his body. Suddenly, the original beta appeared. Her name was Tessa and she was once Huber's beta. Tessa became Avant's beta when he took over control. Avant appeared after Tessa. Avant was seated and he was attired in a business suit like all the other principals. However, Avant wore a grey business suit. Avant worked in the Regulation Department in the United States Treasury Department. He was 53 years old. He was married and had 3 children. However, Avant was estranged from his wife and he was in an affair with Tessa. Good evening, gentlemen. I have called this meeting to discuss Wakanda, said Avant. Slater brought his right hand to the side of his face, the thumb at the edge of the mouth and the index finger on the temple. Slater listened attentively to Avant. I want Wakanda to join our organization, said Avant. What? Said Slater while he eased slowly forward in the chair. Avant stared directly at Slater. I want Presidents T'Challa and Aurora working with us, said Avant. Slater looked at the other principals for their facial responses. But no one expressed much. We regulate the global economy, said Avant. A part of that regulation is the regulation of technology and its uses. Wakanda's advanced tech will greatly diminish costs in the production of goods and services. Additionally, Wakanda exchanges information with the Hedus alien civilization. The most advanced nation on Earth and the most advanced civilization in the universe are that close. Yet the rest of Earth's nations are outside of those benefits. But Presidents T'Challa and Aurora will not condone our methods of regulation. They are heroes for God's sakes, said Slater. Aren't we heroes? Asked Avant. Not in their terms, responded Slater. Then Slater became serious because Avant threatened to break the secrecy of the organization. Huber had stressed that the organization remained out of sight. How were you intending to bring them in? Asked Slater, and he deliberately stressed the dangerousness in his voice. A scheme, of course. I plan to influence the lifting of the international isolation policy from Wakanda. T'Challa and Aurora would be allowed to lend Wakanda's assistance to a greater number of countries, but we will influence which country gets what, answered Avant. But, said Slater. Avant cut him off. The fact of the matter is that the major countries that signed onto the treaty to isolate Wakanda cannot sustain the economic packages that were promised to the developing nations for their cooperation in the matter. Once the policy has been lifted from Wakanda, the major countries can reallocate the package monies to other areas such as debt repayment to China, Saudi Arabia, and Russia, said Avant. This idea is beneficial to everyone. But what of the risk of exposure to us? Inquired Slater. If you bring T'Challa and Aurora within a sniff, eventually they will suspect something. Your reckless scheme will endanger the organization. Avant's expression darkened. I intend to implement this scheme, said Avant. This is the opportunity, thought Slater. You will destroy everything that Uber built, said Slater, and he glanced at the other principals. Therefore I am retiring you and taking control of the organization. Slater stood and he looked down on Avant. The other principals rose in support of Slater. Avant was silent for a moment. Very well. I know that you have sought the leadership to the point of having meetings behind my back, said Avant while he rubbed his left cheek briskly with his right thumb. Avant stood. Slater was prepared for physical combat over the decision. Instead, Avant pulled on his suit jacket like a gentleman. Avant turned to Tessa. Plug us out, said Avant. Avant and Tessa disappeared. Avant took the optical device from his face. Tessa had reverted into her human form. She was a slender woman, with curly yellow hair, light green eyes and a small waist. Moreover, Uber had stopped Tessa's aging, therefore, Tessa forever looked like a 35-years-old woman. Avant rubbed his eyes briefly with the left-hand thumb and index finger. Then Avant's sight returned to his winter cabin. You're going to tell Uber, right? Asked Tessa. Avant rose from his desk and he went towards Tessa. Avant held Tessa close to him. We shouldn't wake him, said Avant, besides I have a plan. I want you to gather the files on the successor candidates. Afterwards you will send an anonymous message to T'Challa and Ororo. The message will contain the background information on Slater and the other principals. Tell T'Challa and Ororo that these people run a secret cabal that kills and manipulates anyone to achieve their objectives. Put in the Myrmidon's latest mission and that they must be stopped. Tessa's eyes turned to a white glow because Avant was breaking Uber's code of secrecy. Avant held Tessa tenderly to allay her fears. But why do this? Asked Tessa. Slater fears the Black Panther and Storm, therefore I will send them to him. The Black Panther and Storm will destroy Slater and the rest. Afterwards we will quietly rebuild the Regulators with the recruits, answered Avant. And you're sure of this? Quizzed Tessa. Black Panther and Storm will have to go through the Myrmidons. That's Goldfire and Hunter. Then Slater and the others have the security machinery of their countries. I have studied the Black Panther and Storm. They will succeed, said Avant. Then Avant kissed Tessa deeply to melt her concerns. Chapter 2. T'Challa and Ororo never worried about reaching late to the presidential office, because they used the sword that T'Challa had built from twin time-space computers and dark force energy shaped into a thick blade. The sword weighed the same as a samurai sword, nano-robots sheathed the blade and the time-space computers were disguised as Gold Panther seals on the hilt. Additionally, the sword made teleportations. Therefore, T'Challa and Ororo arrived at the presidential office in nanoseconds after they had left their house. The executive chamber had 2 desks. The right side desk was T'Challa's while the left side desk was Ororo's. 2 female executive assistants furnished T'Challa and Ororo with the schedule for the day. Expectedly the red phone rang. The red phone was an audio-video system that any nation's leader could call for assistance. T'Challa and Ororo had told the world the number for the red phone. But the call was not a voice message, rather it was an anonymous data file. The file contained a picture of Slater as the leader of the Regulators, pictures of other principals and their backgrounds. Additionally, the file mentioned the activities of the Regulators and the crimes that they had committed. Furthermore, the Regulators had authorized the destruction of a village in Epee. The attack was scheduled for the next hour. T'Challa and Ororo were uncertain if the file was a hoax or a real threat. But they took no chances. T'Challa sent the file in the intelligence division. I want a thorough check of those backgrounds, said T'Challa to the division manager. Meanwhile, Ororo ordered the preparation of the presidential jet with all the information on Epei and the targeted village. T'Challa and Ororo teleported into the presidential jet. The presidential jet had a feline-like design specifically for the high speeds that it reached. Additionally, the presidential jet had the ability to fly backwards due to the engines on the wings that faced backwards. Inside the presidential jet there were 3 separate sections: the cockpit, the storage compartment and a mini medical room. The cockpit was spacious with 5 seats that included the pilot seat and co-pilot seat. Ororo knew that T'Challa had a special interest in learning the truth about the Regulators, because T'Challa was once invited to be a part of a superhero version of the Regulators. T'Challa had rejected the offer. T'Challa had declined for both a public reason and a private one. The public reason was that a group of secret superhero regulators was doomed to failure because of infighting over courses of actions. The private reason was that T'Challa already spied on all the various superhero communities. The spying began when a younger T'Challa had entered the international superhero community. T'Challa didn't trust his comrades and he saw them as potential threats to Wakanda. T'Challa had planted Wakanda surveillance systems in all the major military countries. These smart bugs went dormant and avoided detection. They monitored any covert or overt communications. Additionally, spy androids code-named Casper Coles were across the globe in strategic positions of foreign intelligence. T'Challa piloted the jet while Ororo viewed the information. The presidential jet headed for Epei. Chapter 3 The Myrmidons consisted of 5 disenchanted ex-guerrillas from across the earth who were fed up of their leaders, selling out their principles, trading in narcotics, working for business interests and leading poorly. Uber had found each of the group members who had varying degrees of mutant and meta-human abilities. Uber made the members stronger and he handed them a new purpose in life. The purpose was to make the world a better place even if it meant intimidation, murder, and exhortation. The members of the team were Goldfire, Gavitan, Hunter, Slip and Scattershot. Goldfire was the leader of the Myrmidons and one of the 2 powerhouses on the team. Goldfire was blonde, she had a crossbow tattoo on the left side of her neck. She was a meta-human who created nuclear energy from her hands or her mind. Additionally, Goldfire manipulated the nuclear energy. The second in command was Gavitan. Gavitan was 5'7". He possessed the power to increase the atomic mass of an object or a person. The other member was Hunter and the next powerhouse. Hunter was once a human but military experiments transformed him into a creature that was adaptable both defensively and offensively to any situation. The adaptability was instantaneous. Therefore Hunter was an efficient killer, the perfect predator. Slip was a teleporter and a smart mouth. He was 6'2" and he had brown hair. He was 43 years old. Scattershot was 38 years old. He had short black hair and bread. He had a temper that only Goldfire could control. Scattershot had 12 small tubes that grew out his back. The tubes were channels for projectiles that Scattershot's body produced. The projectiles were similar to armor-piercing bullets and they were fired rapidly from the tubes. The length of the tubes also increased the range of Scattershot's fire. The Myrmidons' latest mission was the destruction of a village, which threatened the transportation route of a mineral supplier. The mineral was vital to the production of goods in the major economies. If the supplier company were forced to change routes, the outcome would be a higher transport cost. The transport cost would be passed on along the production chain and eventually lead to a higher cost for the final products. The manufacturers of the final products provided jobs for millions of people. Moreover, the manufacturers had to keep their prices down in the competitive market because consumers were price sensitive. Therefore, the regulators believed that they had to protect the manufacturers and the transport cost needed to be kept low, hence, the eradication of the villagers. The villagers once lived in the area where the supplier mined the mineral. The villagers were forced off the land by the government and they were relocated. But a war in the new settlement drove the villagers back to their original area. The villagers had hijacked the minerals and sold them back to the supplier company. Goldfire piloted the Myrmidon's stealth jet plane at full speed towards the village. Suddenly the jet's sensors picked up another jet plane. The strange jet communicated to the Myrmidons. "This is President T'Challa of Wakanda. Identify yourself." Chapter 4. T'Challa waited for a response but none came. Ororo sensed the invisible jet through the wind currents. "Move a little closer to the left, that will put us alongside it," said Ororo. T'Challa followed the instructions. "It has to be them," said T'Challa. "I will give them a warning shot," said Ororo. Ororo concentrated. A lightning bolt flashed in the sky and struck the Myrmidon's jet. The voltage knocked out the invisibility systems of the Myrmidon's jet. The Myrmidon's jet was the same size as presidential jet. Additionally, the Myrmidon's jet was wingless and twin engines powered it. "Unknown plane, identify yourself else you will be shot down," said T'Challa over the communications channel. Meanwhile, on the Myrmidon's jet, Goldfire kept her composure. The village was within a minute, therefore, Goldfire kept to the flight path. However, Goldfire planned a retaliation. She looked through the cockpit window at the presidential jet that was close by. Goldfire knew that T'Challa was the Black Panther and that Ororo was codename Storm. Goldfire summoned a nuclear wave with her mind. The nuclear wave engulfed the presidential jet in a white glow and it eventually damaged the jet's single engine. The nuclear wave disappeared. The presidential jet dipped forward and started a descent. Goldfire smiled. Suddenly lightning attacked the Myrmidon's jet. The engines failed and the jet lost altitude within seconds. Incidentally, the presidential jet and the Myrmidon jet collided while they fell. The right wing of the presidential jet stuck violently into the side of the Myrmidon jet. The two jets were in an uncontrolled descent and they crashed into the jungle that bordered the village. Both jets flipped, rolled, and skidded through the jungle until they lost momentum. The jets settled within meters of each other. Chapter 5. Goldfire gathered herself. The Myrmidon jet was upside down. There were cracks in the cockpit windows. The controls indicated multiple electrical fires. "Everyone intact besides Hunter?" asked Goldfire jokingly. Scattershot laughed at the joke. "Yes," replied Scattershot. Gavitan and Slip started laughing when the joke caught on. "All right guys," said Goldfire while she unfastened the seatbelt and she acrobatically slipped out of the chair. "We continue the mission. Gavitan, Slip, and Scattershot head for the village. Hunter and I will deal with the Black Panther and Storm." Goldfire blasted a hole through the hull with nuclear beams that shot from her fists. Goldfire peered out the hole. The presidential jet was unstuck from the Myrmidon jet and it was nearby. Goldfire jumped out of the hole and her team followed. Slip teleported Scattershot, Gavitan, and himself to the village. Hunter surveyed the presidential jet, which had survived the crash better than the wrecked Myrmidon jet. Then T'Challa and Ororo emerged from the presidential jet. "Which one are you taking?" asked Hunter. "Black Panther has special tech. You can handle those surprises better than I can. I will take on Storm. Let's make this quick." "No opportunity must be given to them," replied Goldfire. Goldfire concentrated and she used her powers for flight. Hunter ran forward. T'Challa activated the Dark Force Field Controller, which created a shield around his body. Then T'Challa withdrew the sword that was magnetized to his back. The nano-robot's sheath disappeared from the Dark Force blade. "They have split up, so we have to make this hard and fast," said T'Challa. "I'll take the flyer," said Ororo, and she flew into the sky. T'Challa and Hunter charged into each other. Similarly, Ororo and Goldfire flew head to head. T'Challa wasted no time and he stabbed his sword into Hunter. Simultaneously, Hunter's right hand adapted to the dark force field and the hand glowed red. Hunter's right hand passed through the dark force field and it held onto T'Challa's shoulder. Meanwhile, Hunter held the part of the sword's blade that was outside of his body with his left hand. Hunter's left hand glowed red. Then Hunter's body strength increased to a superhuman level. Afterwards, spiked adamantium tentacles erupted out of Hunter's sides. The tentacles glowed red. Then the tentacles passed through both the force field and T'Challa's vibranium body armor. The tentacles buried themselves into T'Challa's abdomen and they went through T'Challa's legs. T'Challa did not scream because of adrenaline rush. Instead, T'Challa stared intensely into Hunter's eyes. T'Challa realized that his defenses were breached and that he was dying. Moreover, T'Challa knew that his attack was ineffective on Hunter. Additionally, T'Challa was immobilized by Hunter's hold and the tentacles through the legs. One chance, thought T'Challa. Nebula system, said T'Challa. The sword computers understood and they teleported along with T'Challa and Hunter into space. T'Challa released the sword handle. T'Challa's free hand damaged the pressure points on Hunter that caused paralysis, which led to death in 5 seconds. Instantaneously, Hunter's body began to fight the effects. However, Hunter had to release T'Challa from the tentacles and shoulder hold. T'Challa withdrew the sword from Hunter with the right hand. Then T'Challa punched Hunter in the face with the left fist. Hunter drifted away. Then the sword teleported T'Challa and itself back to the jungle. Hunter survived the paralysis attack and he realized that he was in space. No, thought Hunter. Hunter's body changed from an organic to a crystalline form. Otherwise, Hunter would have died from reduced air pressure in the lungs and the boiling of his blood in another 5 seconds. Therefore, Hunter drifted like a statue in space. T'Challa reappeared in the jungle in the same spot that he had vanished. Goldfire's lifeless body lay nearby on the ground. Ororo had manipulated the oxygen out of Goldfire's lungs. Ororo descended next to T'Challa, then they teleported to the village. At the village, Gavitan had increased the atomic mass of the villagers. As a result, they were immobilized and unable to defend themselves. Meanwhile, Scattershot and Slip had opened fire indiscriminately into the men, women, and children. T'Challa and Ororo appeared. T'Challa teleported towards Slip and decapitated him. Then T'Challa teleported to Gavitan. T'Challa ran the sword through Gavitan. Afterwards, T'Challa dropped to his knees as he finally felt the pain from his injuries. T'Challa slowed his heartbeat rate to survive. Meanwhile, Ororo killed Scattershot with a lightning strike from her fingertips. Then T'Challa and Ororo teleported to the Wakanda Defense Division Infirmary. Chapter 6. Doctors operated on T'Challa's injuries with stem cells and proteins. The stem cells repaired the damaged tissues in the intestines and the legs. The proteins fixed the autonomic nerves. Ororo had watched on during the operation. Afterwards, the operation ended without any complications. T'Challa was released from the infirmary. T'Challa dressed into a new body armor suit while Ororo looked on. "You really have 9 lives," remarked Ororo. "I'm glad that I am spending them with you," said T'Challa. Ororo smiled and took a step closer to T'Challa. They kissed each other deeply. "I love you," said Ororo. "I love you too," said T'Challa. But T'Challa was concerned in the back of his mind, because the dark force field was breached. "I can't rely on it," thought T'Challa. After T'Challa and Ororo finished their moment, they headed for the intelligence division. The background information on Slater and other principals was verified. Moreover, a trace on the source of the anonymous message was inconclusive. "This doesn't feel right," said T'Challa as he studied the information on Slater. "I agree," said Ororo, "someone wants us to take him out, but what will that someone gain in the end?" "It could be anything from revenge to justice served," said T'Challa. T'Challa noticed a detail in the background information. The detail was the Uber Foundation. Slater benefited from the foundation. T'Challa scanned through the other principals and they were also assisted by the Uber Foundation. T'Challa requested information on the Uber Foundation. The information was retrieved and sent for T'Challa's and Ororo's review. The Uber Foundation first appeared in 1967 and it gave grants to selected economics and physics students. The foundation was started by Alan Uber, an American. Alan Uber had disappeared for quite a while and the only property that was in his name was a croft in Scotland. "Let's see if we can learn anything from that place," said T'Challa. Then T'Challa and Ororo left for Scotland in a new presidential jet. Chapter 7 Alan Uber was the son of a German father and a Scottish mother. Uber was born in 1900. The family first resided in Kleindeutschland or Little Germany that was located on the Lower East Side of Manhattan, New York. However, in 1904 the General Slocum incident occurred and the family eventually moved to Yorkville. Yorkville was in the Upper East Side of Manhattan, New York. Uber's father opened a bookstore and Uber became an assistant when he was 10 years old. Uber became fascinated with economics when he had read the theorist Adam Smith's book The Wealth of Nations. As a result, Uber's ambition in life was to become an economist. Uber turned 12 and his mutant powers caused by the X gene manifested themselves. Uber took 2 years to understand his gifts, which he kept secret. Meanwhile, Uber left the bookstore and he went to work for his father's brother who was a shipper. The Roaring Twenties descended on New York and Uber made a fortune in his uncle's business during those booming consumers spending years. Additionally, Uber graduated from university with top honors in economics. Then Uber entered the banking service. Eventually Uber married and tried to have a family. Unfortunately, Uber's wife could not conceive and the marriage fell apart. Uber married again. Still, the marriage never produced children. Uber found out that the problem was with him for an unknown reason. Uber accepted the fact because he understood that a man could have the world and not have the one thing that mattered to him. Uber blamed his powers for the ill fortune in the back of his mind. Uber's abilities were vast: telepathy, telekinesis, teleportation, molecular control of objects and organisms, flight, energy projection, attack to his person deflection, concealment of his powers from other mutants or metahumans, and survival without food or air. Uber ended his second marriage in 1930, and then the Great Depression struck. The sight of the poverty sickened Uber. Consequently, he resigned from the bank and he went to Europe. But the terrible economic situation was the same in Europe. Subsequently, Uber traveled the world and he witnessed the squalor in nations that was caused by the free market and poor government management. In the years between 1932 and 1966, Uber devised the framework for the regulation of the world economy. Uber envisioned that the regulators were independent of governments that pandered to the electorate for re-elections other than listening to the advice of the economists. Additionally, the regulators would aid the free market from unnecessary disturbances. The disturbances were wars, disastrous activities of financial officials in the free markets, changes in the supply chains, and the bad decisions of major manufacturers. As a result, Uber realized that the black markets, financial institutions, and administrations had to be monitored. Moreover, Uber believed that lethal force was necessary at times, thus, he created the Myrmidons. Afterwards, Uber searched the globe for recruits to monitor the major and potentially major world economies. Uber found the individuals and he trained them for service to the world. Uber transmutated the individuals who he called principals. Uber created the betas and he made them more powerful than he originally had intended. The reason was that Uber anticipated the expansion of the world's communication networks, both the covert and the overt. When Uber was in his early 90s, he planned for a successor. The reason was that Uber was tired of life and there were others capable of running the regulators in his absence. Uber chose Avant and Slater as candidates for leadership. Avant and Slater competed fiercely for the position. Uber made Avant the leader. The reason was that Avant was never hesitant with a decision, whereas Slater was cautious. Uber believed that the leader of the regulators needed decisiveness. Furthermore, Uber created a succession program for the principals so the regulators as an organization had a certain future. Uber had given the principals the power to transfer their abilities to whomever they wanted. Uber expounded that the regulators forever remained a secret in his farewell speech. Afterwards, Uber acquired a croft in Scotland that once belonged to his mother's family and he retired to a self-imposed sleep beneath the property. Chapter 8 Wakanda's spy satellites discovered the chamber underneath the croft. T'Challa and Ororo were notified. A closed door was at the entrance of the chamber. Ororo cut a circle in the thick chamber door with plasma energy that flowed from her right fist. T'Challa kicked down the cutout. Then T'Challa and Ororo entered the chamber. T'Challa's and Ororo's night vision allowed them sight. But the chamber lights activated themselves. The chamber's ground was dirt. There was an open sarcophagus that stood at the opposite end of the chamber. T'Challa and Ororo neared the sarcophagus. Uber was inside of the sarcophagus. Uber was attired in tan shirt jacket, trousers, and boots. He smelled moldy. Additionally appeared to be 95 years old. Ororo observed that Uber registered an electromagnetic current in his body. "He isn't dead but asleep," said Ororo. "Then we'll not be disturbing the dead," remarked T'Challa. T'Challa tapped lightly on Uber's left shoulder. It seemed that there was no effect. Suddenly Uber opened his eyes. Uber's pupils were yellow. Uber's eyes moved from T'Challa to Ororo. The eye movement expressed the question, "Who are these people?" Then Uber used his telekinesis on T'Challa and Ororo. T'Challa and Ororo were thrown backwards. T'Challa landed on his feet, he took the sword from off his back and he prepared for a fight. Ororo fell on her back. Ororo cat sprung onto her feet and she kept electrical charges between her fingers. The stiffness in Uber's muscles disappeared. Yet Uber walked slowly out of the sarcophagus. Uber used his telepathy simultaneously on both T'Challa and Ororo for answers on their identities. Ororo's resistance to the probe was in the form of an electrical current around her head that fortified her mind. Meanwhile, T'Challa's mental trap for unauthorized telepathy probes was activated. Uber was inside of T'Challa's mind. The mindscape was a thick jungle and an unseen fierce creature stalked Uber. "This may work on a lesser telepath but I am not that case," said Uber. Uber intensified the mental attack on T'Challa. T'Challa dropped on his hands and knees as he fought Uber's telepathy attack. T'Challa dug his fingers into the ground and he grimaced. "See here, you cannot win," said Uber. Ororo fired electrical bolts from her hands at Uber. The electrical bolts returned to Ororo and they struck her about the body. T'Challa realized that Uber was slowly winning. T'Challa reached for the dark force controller and he activated it. Immediately, T'Challa was protected from Uber's telepathic assault. T'Challa took out a light knife from his suit. T'Challa threw the knife at Uber. The knife returned to T'Challa. The knife was blocked by the force field, which prevented the knife from striking T'Challa in the face. Ororo recognized that T'Challa and her were at a tactical disadvantage. Nevertheless, Ororo knew of a potential weapon that was capable of defeating Uber. But the weapon was in Wakanda. Additionally, the weapon required Ororo's thief skills to work. Hence Ororo had to return to Wakanda for the weapon. Ororo gambled that T'Challa's force field would hold out until she returned, even though Hunter's attack had proven that the force field had new vulnerabilities. "Sword to me," shouted Ororo. The sword had memorized the Croft's location, therefore, Ororo could teleport back to the fight. The sword teleported into Ororo's hand. Ororo teleported to Wakanda's defense division. "She has deserted you," said Uber. "I know better," said T'Challa. Uber realized that he wasn't not going to learn anything from T'Challa. But it was clear that the secrecy of the organization was compromised. Therefore Uber wanted to kill T'Challa. Uber tried telekinesis on T'Challa, but the attack was futile. Uber concluded that tactically T'Challa and himself were invulnerable to each other's attacks. "I have to regulate the environment to my advantage," thought Uber. Uber activated his flight ability. He floated inches off the ground. Then Uber aimed his right hand at the ground and he manipulated the molecules in the ground. Suddenly, the chamber's ground disappeared. T'Challa had noticed that Uber had pointed to the ground. Thus T'Challa attempted to leap at the ceiling. T'Challa intended to use the claws in his gloves to hang onto the ceiling. However, the ground had disappeared a fraction too early before T'Challa's leap. As a result, T'Challa plunged into the apparent abyss. Uber waited until T'Challa disappeared from his sight, then Uber returned the chamber's ground. Thus T'Challa was buried alive. Ororo reappeared. She glanced quickly for T'Challa. "He has passed on," said Uber in a deep voice. Ororo doubted Uber. Ororo stuck to her plan and she reached Uber in a flash. But Ororo didn't attack Uber. Instead, Ororo used her skills as a former pickpocket to plant the weapon on Uber without him knowing. Uber summoned a strong telekinesis push. The push flung Ororo from Uber. Ororo slammed into the wall at the other end of the chamber. Ororo fell forward onto the ground and she was unconscious. Uber used his molecular abilities to sense Ororo's injuries. Ororo had 2 fractured ribs, there was internal bleeding, her left leg was broken and she had a concussion. Uber estimated that Ororo had an hour to live. Therefore Uber took no further action against Ororo. Uber needed answers for T'Challa's and Ororo's intrusion. Therefore Uber telepathically searched for Avant and Slater. Uber found them. Avant and Slater were in their work offices. Fortunately for Uber, the 2 men were alone. Therefore Uber teleported Avant and Slater to the chamber. Chapter 9. Avant saw Ororo, yet he kept his composure. Avant knew it was a matter of moments before Uber learnt the truth. Slater was perplexed. "Uber, what happened here?" Slater asked respectfully. "I was attacked by this woman and a man." "Have you seen her before?" asked Uber. "Of course. She is Ororo, also known as Storm." "If the man was in a black body armor, then he was most likely T'Challa the Black Panther," replied Slater. Avant had wished to bring them into the organization. Slater looked accusingly at Avant. "Why were they here?" "Avant?" asked Uber. Avant straightened his tie. Avant quickly thought of a means of escape. "I don't know," replied Avant, "but since you have been awakened, I want to bring to your attention that I have been replaced as leader of the Regulators by Slater." Uber looked at Slater. "Over said issue of bringing in Black Panther and Storm into our organization. Avant's action threatened the secrecy. I acted accordingly," said Slater as he faced Uber. "You acted wrongly. I appointed Avant, not you," said Uber, "and what is this Avant of bringing strangers into the organization? I clearly stated that no one must know of us." Uber continued, "What is going on?" What is the state of the Earth's economy since my absence? Must I return? Avant had feared that Uber might return to the leadership if he was awakened, hence the reason Avant had used T'Challa and Ororo against the Regulators. Steady growth overall, a few declines in minor economies, replied Avant. Suddenly T'Challa's gloved hand erupted out of the ground. There were 5 metal claws that extended out of the fingertips of the gloved hand. Concurrently, Ororo awakened. She attempted to stand and she realized that her left leg was broken. However, Ororo's strong will motivated her. Ororo clenched her teeth and she realigned the damaged leg. Crack! Then Ororo used the sword to stand up. She felt her sides and experience told her that the ribs were damaged. T'Challa clawed his way completely out of the ground. The force field had prevented the earth from crushing T'Challa when Uber had buried him. T'Challa had expanded the force field for additional room. Then T'Challa had activated the vibranium claws in his gloves. Afterwards T'Challa dug a tunnel at an angle towards the surface. All the while, T'Challa conserved his breath. Uber sensed that T'Challa's arm muscles were exhausted. T'Challa was upright and his body's posture was in a state of readiness for anything. T'Challa smelled that Ororo was around. T'Challa glanced at Ororo. Ororo winked at T'Challa, which indicated that she was all right. T'Challa returned his attention to the Regulators. T'Challa recognized Slater. But Avant was a mystery to T'Challa. Nevertheless, T'Challa saw an opportunity to find out who was manipulating Ororo and himself. Slater, said T'Challa, someone wants you and the Regulators gone. That someone sent us details on you and your organization. Any ideas who? Chapter 10. Naturally, Slater was surprised that T'Challa knew his name. Slater turned to Avant. Slater spoke to Uber. Search his mind. He must be the one responsible since I took the leadership from him, said Slater while he pointed in Avant's face. Avant knocked Slater's hand from his face. I admit it, said Avant coolly since the end was inevitable. Uber could not believe his ears. His work was on the verge of ruin because of a power struggle. Stop it acting like children. It is clear that I must return, said Uber. I punish both you for this infighting. I am taking back the powers, wiping your memories of the organization and me. Then I will put you back in your civilian lives. Both Avant and Slater were engulfed in an emerald light before they had a chance to protest the punishment and the men disappeared. Uber telepathically informed the other principals and the betas of Avant's and Slater's fate. I have returned to lead, said Uber. Uber tried to contact the Myrmidons but their minds were absent from the earth. Uber ended his message. Uber looked at T'Challa and Ororo. Loose ends, thought Uber. But Uber had a question for T'Challa and Ororo. Did you encounter the Myrmidons? Asked Uber. They're dead, replied T'Challa. Uber did not think. He only reacted. Uber's intention was to rip Ororo's molecules apart simultaneously. T'Challa was to fall further into the earth where the claws were useless against the rocks and there was not enough time to return to the surface before he died from suffocation. But nothing happened. Uber attempted to use his powers once more and they failed him. What is this? Asked Uber. Uber walked forward and an invisible barrier blocked him. It works by permanently using your bioforce against you. First it does a scan of the body, then it dissolves into the air and it creates the necessary containment, said Ororo. I expected it to work sooner but it doesn't matter now. Uber pressed his palms on the barrier. I will be free, said Uber. Ororo felt ill. The internal bleeding affected her. T'Challa, time to go, said Ororo. T'Challa hurried to Ororo. Ororo rested her head on T'Challa's right shoulder. Then the couple teleport to Wakanda's defense infirmary. Chapter 11 Uber's Croft was bought over secretly by Wakanda. Casper Cole androids secured the premises. Uber was kept in the Bioforce prison under the Croft. Furthermore, Casper Cole androids covertly delivered video cards to the principals and the betas. The video cards were small and flat like bank cards. On the surface was the Black Panther seal. The recipient's fingerprint was registered in the video cards. Once the recipient touched the card, the Black Panther seal disappeared and the video screen appeared. T'Challa and Aurora were on the screen. Discontinue your Regulators organization activities, else suffer the fate of Uber, Avant, Slater, and the Myrmidons, said T'Challa. We are watching you. Then the message ended. Meanwhile, Tessa stayed away from Avant since he had no memory of their relationship. On the other hand, Slater returned to his family life and official work, but he discovered password-encrypted files on his computers related to principal duties, which he can't remember creating.